There is a fantasy that visits far more people than ever admitted out loud, usually arriving in ordinary, undramatic moments, stuck in traffic, sitting through a routine meeting, lying awake at night. The specific daydream of simply disappearing, walking away from the job, the responsibilities, sometimes even the people, and starting over somewhere completely unknown, with no explanation owed to anyone. Most people dismiss this fantasy quickly, embarrassed by it, assuming it means something is wrong with them or their otherwise perfectly reasonable life. Carl Jung's understanding of the unlived life and a call toward individuation offers a genuinely different explanation for why this particular fantasy is so common and what it might actually be pointing toward. Jung believed that the desire to disappear rarely reflects a literal wish to abandon every relationship and responsibility a person holds. It far more often reflects something more specific and more psychologically precise, an unconscious protest against a life that has become too completely defined by roles, obligations, and other people's expectations, with too little space remaining for whatever genuinely individual and unrepeatable self exists underneath all of those roles. The fantasy of disappearing is, in Jung's understanding, rarely actually about the specific job or the specific relationships being imagined as abandoned. It is about the accumulated weight of a life that has left almost no room for anything the person would recognize as fully, privately, their own. This explains why the fantasy tends to intensify precisely during periods when a person's actual life has become most completely defined by external obligation, a demanding job, a heavy caretaking role, a long stretch without any genuine personal space or personal time. Jung's understanding suggests the fantasy of complete disappearance functions almost like a pressure valve, an unconscious way of imagining total relief from an accumulated weight that has, in reality, become genuinely excessive, even if every individual obligation contributing to that weight is, examined separately, entirely reasonable and even genuinely valued. There is a further layer worth understanding here, connected to what Jung called the call toward individuation. The inner pressure every person eventually feels toward becoming a distinct individual rather than remaining defined primarily by their relationships and social roles. Jung believed this call could arrive quietly for years, easily ignored amid the genuine demands of ordinary responsible life, but that it tends to grow louder and more insistent the longer it goes unheeded, sometimes eventually expressing itself through exactly this kind of dramatic fantasy of total escape. Since the individuation impulse, denied any smaller and more manageable outlet, begins imagining the most extreme version of relief it can picture. This offers something genuinely important for relating to this fantasy without either dismissing it entirely or taking it as a literal plan that must be acted upon. The fantasy of disappearing is worth taking seriously as a genuine signal, not necessarily that the current life needs to be entirely abandoned, but that something in the current arrangement of that life has left insufficient room for whatever genuinely individual self exists beneath all the roles and obligations currently being carried. The extreme, total nature of the fantasy, disappearing completely rather than making a smaller adjustment, often simply reflects how long the underlying need has gone unaddressed, rather than indicating that only total escape could actually satisfy it. This suggests a genuinely useful practice for anyone who recognizes this fantasy recurring in their own life. Rather than either suppressing the fantasy in shame or treating it as a serious plan to actually execute, it is worth asking honestly what specific quality the fantasy of disappearing actually represents. Freedom from constant obligation, space for an interest or a part of the self that has been neglected, simple rest from being needed by everyone else, and then asking what smaller, more sustainable version of that specific quality might actually be built into the current life, rather than requiring total abandonment of everything infrand and bidden. There is real relief available in understanding the disappearing fantasy this way. It is not evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with a person's character or their life choices. It is evidence, according to Jung's understanding, of a genuine individuation need that has gone unaddressed for too long, expressing itself through the most dramatic form available because smaller, more sustainable forms of the same relief were never actually built in. Taking the fantasy seriously as information, rather than either shame or a literal plan, often reveals a smaller and more achievable change that can address the actual underlying need directly. Think honestly about your own version of this fantasy if you recognize it, and consider what specific quality it actually represents for you: freedom, rest, space, recognition, or something else entirely, separate from the literal image of walking away from everything. If you experience this fantasy with any regularity, write below the single word for what you suspect it is actually asking for. Naming it honestly is often the first step toward building a smaller, sustainable version of that need into your actual life, rather than continuing to only imagine the most extreme and least achievable version of relief. Because the fantasy of disappearing completely was never, according to Carl Jung's understanding, evidence that something was wrong with the person having it. It was, far more often, an individual self quietly and insistently asking for room to exist, using the only language available once every smaller and more reasonable request had gone unheard for far too long.